after a bit of that training with the flight instructor, there came a moment when he said, okay, now I want you to take it around the field, take her back up. McGee, go ahead and do your thing by yourself.
Yeah,
what was that like? I mean, how did you feel when you accomplished that?
Well, it was a real thrill to realize that suddenly you've got the stick and there's nobody back there or in front of you, rather watching you to see whether you're doing it right. You're on your own, and I'm sure the heart rate went up a bit, but still controllable because I was able to get it off and get it back on those first flights and continue the training. But it added to the thrill that I found in flying, that to be able to get off the ground and suddenly no longer be bound by the wheels touching the ground, that you could turn her upside down or do all that the aircraft, depending on the horsepower, was capable of doing. That was a thrill that has continued to grow.
What was the first plane you flew?
Pt.2, which was an open cockpit bi-wing plane of about 450 horsepower, and that was really flying by the seat of the pants, because you listened to how the wind sounded in passing over the struts and the wiring of the wings and that type of thing, and very few instruments in the plane, and you had an altimeter and so on to tell how high you were climbing and that type of thing, the airspeed indicator, but a lot of it was by feel in those early hours.
June 30th, 1943.
Great day of graduation, not only to be commissioned as a second lieutenant, but to realize that they were pinning those silver wings on our jacket or our shirt, and that we had made the grade to become an Army Air Corps pilot, and looking forward to that opportunity to get into a P-40.
What was the sense of accomplishment for you? How did that feel?
That gave you a real sense of accomplishment, because here's, and particularly because of the attitudes that it wasn't believed that we were capable of flying aircraft and absorbing the training necessary to handle an aircraft proficiently, and so it was a very gleeful day. Smiles were much broader, and of course the good wishes from all of those behind who were still striving, and those who had already were ahead welcoming us. It was kind of a heady feeling.
I bet.
Yes.
Now let me ask you, I'm kind of backtracking a little bit, but prior to you getting into the school, there, as the story goes, Eleanor Roosevelt had something to do with that program kind of getting off the ground. What was the impact, do you think, of Eleanor Roosevelt's?
Well, she was one of the people who, behind the scenes, did things and said things that not only upheld some of the laws that were beginning to be passed, but I think had a keen sense of what is fairness among people, giving everybody an opportunity. And she had been down to Tuskegee on Rosenwald Fund business, and Tuskegee Institute had a very successful civilian pilot training program, and the Army was still giving excuses for not accepting some of the graduates of that program into the Army Air Corps training, and in fact she actually flew with Chief Anderson, Charles Alfred Anderson, who was the chief instructor in the Institute Civilian Pilot Training Program, and there were those that didn't want her to, but the story is that she, back in Washington, indicated he flew just like the white pilots that had been flying her around, and she saw no reason why there shouldn't be a program that included the black opportunity to get pilot training. And it was shortly after that. What impact I'm sure must have had some, that they did approve the program there. And Tuskegee Institute, there was a law passed that allowed the Army to contract the primary phase of training to a civilian pilot program, and Tuskegee Institute applied and got that contract for first the 99th Squadron, and then once they found out, oh, the blacks can fly with given the opportunity, the program expanded and they approved additional fighter squadrons that became the 332nd Fighter Group. So she had, I think, a lot to do with that out of what she said and how much she influenced President Roosevelt. Probably always remains to be a conjecture.
Absolutely. Well, now you completed your pilot training, but now it was time for you to become a fighter pilot. So
That's
that
correct.
final phase was at Michigan, in Michigan, Selfridge?
Yes, we did our P-40 checkout there at Tuskegee before leaving, but we were just about 3 rides, and by this time, June of '43, Tuskegee Army Airfield is quite crowded with the in larger classes coming in and the number of classes in training, and so the 99th had left in spring of April, in fact, of '43. That one squadron had left Tuskegee and gone to North Africa. To form the 3 squadrons that became the 332nd Fighter Group, they used the base up in Michigan, and that's why we went to Selfridge Field, Michigan, as graduates and began to form the 100th, 301st, and 302nd Fighter Squadrons.
Now, while you were there, for a time, you were under the watchful eye of the legendary Benjamin O. Davis, Jr.
Yes.
What was that like? You all, at that point, he was legendary.
He was, because we had become aware of his interest in aviation when he graduated from West Point in '36 and was denied. Was a student officer with the first class and became the commander of the 99th, and by that time we were aware that he was quickly promoted to be up to the level that his West Point counterparts had reached. That is, he came in the program as a captain, but jumped to lieutenant colonel, which was 2 grade increases, and became the commander of the 99th, and then was turned the 99th over to George Roberts and came back to become the commander of the group. So we had great admiration for him. He was just the manner in which he walked about and so on was inspiring and fearsome in a way too. We as second lieutenants talking to a lieutenant colonel and knowing of his West Point training and so on, admired him very much and certainly respected his position as commander.
Was there some added pressure as a trainee? This isn't just some other instructor. This is someone who we aspire to be just like. Was there some added pressure there?
I don't know so much of a pressure, but more of a goal that you didn't want to cross him, if you will, in one respect as a senior officer, and the other to do all and be all that he expected and that all of us expected out of the experience of becoming an Army pilot. So we put a lot into the training that is added on. And of course, we had our pilot's wings, but these were the specialties that had to do with the combat performance and the formations and the gunnery and the bombing and the things that we would be doing to carry out the missions that were assigned. So that was impetus that we continued to do our best and to make the grade.
Now, up until this point, you trained on P-40Zs, P-40Ns, and then the decision was suddenly made for you all when it was time for you to go to fight. You were going to fly the Bell P-39.
Oh, P-39 Bell Air Cobra
But
aircraft.
the plane was not as much horsepower. The engine was
Not
in the
quite,
back.
yeah, just a little bit. The engine was behind, but it was the aircraft available for what you would call interceptor work, because they decided that the mission for the group, and that was those three, the 100th, 301st, and 302nd, was going to be harbor and coastal patrol. And so we went directly to Italy after completing training in December of 43. We did some additional gunnery and formation to get used to the P-39 and be prepared and upgrade our skills in the bombing and handling of that aircraft. And the 3 squadrons went directly to Italy. In the meantime, the 99th was attached to white groups, and they're carrying bombs. They did some low altitude escort work, but primarily their work was the close support and the interdiction, supporting the ground troops as they moved through out of Africa through Pantelleria, Sicily, into southern Italy.
Now let me ask you about that, because you know, as you're saying now, 43, you guys were bound for Italy, but of course, you didn't know that.
No.
In Christmas, during Christmas,
When
I
we
mean, first
left,
of all, it was 3 days before Christmas, and that must have been hard. That must have been very tough.
It was,
on you
to
and
say
Frances.
goodbye to the families. I had taught her to drive a car because we had picked up a car while we, and because we had lived in the city of Detroit, out from Mount Clemens, Michigan, where Selfridge was located, meant her going home as we prepared to go overseas, and we had no idea how long that separation would be. So it was an exciting time, both as we had completed our the group preparation to enter combat. Where it was going to be, we didn't know, but that did take place in December there, just at Christmas time.
You basically left 3 days before Christmas, bound for Fort Patrick Henry, Virginia, and then from there.
Newport News, Virginia,
Right.
the port, right, where we would embark in the Liberty ships, I think they called them at that time, that would sail in convoy into the Atlantic.
Destination unknown.
Destination unknown,
How
right.
do you mentally prepare for something like that? I mean, yeah, you know, you're training for war, and you know that ultimately that is the end.
Yeah.
To justify the means, but how do you prepare for that? I mean, you know, you just said goodbye to your family,
Yeah.
you know, which was difficult, and now you know you're off and you don't know where you're going.
Yeah, well, all of your training really prepares for it. You just know that you're moving to somewhere where you'll be, again, mated up with airplanes and begin to perform the mission. So it was something, and of course, I guess age and eagerness of youth has something to do with it too. The goodbyes were certainly sad, but yet we realized from the reports coming in the importance of what was going on in the theater of operations, and soon we were going to be a part of it. So that expectation keeps you looking ahead.
So you got to Italy.
Got to Italy, tent cities and all, cold weather and rainy weather and
Got your
all,
first
but
plane.
but we got our airplanes and began to perform our missions, and got a little taste of what war was really like too, because occasionally the Germans did come over during some night raids in the area of Naples that we were in Italy, and so very interesting.
It was more than a little interesting. At one time, it was a bit harrowing. Tell me about your first dogfight that you kind of found yourself in.
Those come. I didn't get into one while we were flying the P-39s, but in April of '44, after a couple of months of flying the P-39, a group was among those selected to help in the escort work that our bombers needed now that they were flying out of Italy and deep into the Balkan and the area of Germany, of course, where they could put up very formidable defenses, and we were losing a lot of bombers and they needed escort. So that's when we stopped the tactical work with P-39 and picked up P-47, the Republic Thunderbolt, big radial engine and an aircraft that could fly to the altitude where the bombers were flying for their bomb runs. And we began that escort, and here Colonel Davis let us know what our role was, and that was to stick with the bombers that we were assigned to for escort. And as if the Germans attacked, we were dispatched depending on the numbers and where the attack came from to fight back. And in fact, we had moved to the P-51, which about July of '44 we got, which is the premier fighter. You ask an old fighter pilot, what's the best aircraft? P-51 Mustang. And we continued flying the P-51 from July of '44 on through the end of the war in the escort work. But it was during that time frame I happened to be in one of the flights dispatched because of German aircraft trying to get to the bombers that we were escorting over North Vienna and Pardubice Aerodrome. Both had been targets for the raid, and I was able to shoot down aircraft at that time.
You just sort of brushed by it like it wasn't such a big deal. It was a little more harrowing than that, wasn't it?
Well, it is a bit harrowing because you realize that somebody is trying to shoot at you and you're trying to get at them, and there's a little give and take in that, and it's a bit exhilarating to know that you came out on top in that type of thing.
What happened exactly? You were on this escort, and then what happened?
Well, you spotted the enemy aircraft approaching were spotted, and you're usually dispatched by a flight of 2 or 4, depending on the number, usually a flight of 4, and because of where they were coming from, my flight was picked to ward them off, and in that chase, that's where what we call the rat racing begins. You're maneuvering to try to get on the tail. If they persist and don't outrun you going home, to get on their tail and destroy the aircraft. You don't try to take a life. You'd hope that pilot, if you do damage the aircraft, gets a chance to bail out. But you don't think about that then, because somebody might be trying to and is trying to get on your tail and fire at you once we get into that rat race. And it's something that happens in just a minute or 2 or 3, and suddenly you find, in the case here, that in getting on this aircraft that we had gone from altitude in a dive down, and we're down almost over the aerodrome when I was able to get a burst into the aircraft and cause them to crash. And at that time you climb back out to try to find and form up again with your buddies, and in this case it came very near the end of the bomb run, and so the bombing is over and the aircraft are already on their return, so it's a matter of climbing back up and joining to return on to home base. But those few minutes pass pretty quickly, and it's over with, and you're fortunate to be on the surviving side.
Did you think about the fact, because I was reading in the book, you thought about whether or not you were going to see a parachute. You never did you?
No, in this case I saw the aircraft crash on the field, and that was confirmed. And don't think the pilot got out, but that was the circumstances of war, because it could have been me had I not been successful.
So after nearly a year in Europe, and at that point, I was reading I guess the magic numbers were 25 and 50, 25 for fighter pilots, 50 for bombers, or maybe
the other way around, 25
for
for bomber pilots, 50, but Well, our replacements were a bit slow in coming because that's one of the bad things of trying to maintain the segregated operation, and we had our own rest camp, our own base, and our own operation. So I had flown 80-some missions in the P-39 in that harbor and coastal patrol work, and 50 some over 50 missions in the escort work before, so I ended up my tour with 136 missions and returned to Tuskegee, and well, I left the combat zone in November of '44 with the trip home and a little rest camp. And that was an experience because the rest camp was Atlantic City, New Jersey, and Negroes had not been in those hotels other than being maids and butlers, if you will, up till that time, but spent rest period in one of the hotels in Atlantic City, and then returned to Tuskegee and entered instructor training because we began to replace the white pilots that had taught us.
But now, after you got back and you were in Atlantic City, and that, as you said, was an experience. I mean, you were definitely into the ice cream and eating real food again, I'm
Yeah,
sure.
boy, for sure. No powdered eggs there, and real ice cream.
And it raised a few eyebrows, and
Yeah.
you thought maybe, perhaps, gosh, you know, this is the fruits of a hard-fought war. I'm on my way home, and then in '45 the war ended, and there were parades across the country. But in Tuskegee, Alabama, you were treated the exact same way as
No,
the day
there were
you
no
left.
parades and no welcome, but it was heartening to join the family together again, and again the idea of still carrying yourself respectfully, that someday respect will come, was still the hope. So that kept us going, even though we didn't have any parades to welcome us home.
In a sense, you did almost come full circle. I mean, your dad, as I said, was an educator, and now you're an educator at Tuskegee, serving as an instructor.
Mm-hmm.
And you kind of settled for a while. What was settled life like for at least a few years before you were called back to service again, for you and the family in Tuskegee?
Well, really good, as I say, for the family to be back together, and I was fortunate to get into twin engine instruction, but because by this time they had a twin engine pilot along with the single engine pilot graduates from Tuskegee, and that just expanded my flying experience, and the aircraft moving from the AT-10, which was a beach aircraft, to what they called the TB-25, because this was the medium bomber, but taking all the armor plate out and the guns made it a very fine training platform. And so again, it just added to my enjoyment of flying and my experience, and being able to join the wife at the end of the day's work. Why, you kind of build your own little nest, if you will, and little nits that made for some enjoyable times as we continued the training there. And of course, in the mid-'46, the training was closed, and by this time, with the war over in Europe and the 332nd pilots returning, and still now some folks, as soon as the opportunity came after the war ended, wanted to get out of the service, go back to school or the work that they had already begun, and others like myself was enjoying the flying and the opportunity, and there was still a requirement. We were all assigned to Lockburn Air Base in Columbus, Ohio, which was a base that they had finally reactivated. Well, there was an interim organization, the 477th Composite Group, which was part of the fighter group and part of the bomb group medium that had been established, and then they reactivated the 332nd Fighter Group.
Now, some years later, you were called into service again. I mean, the North Koreans crossed the 38th parallel into the Republic of Korea, and there you were.
This
ready to rock
became,
and roll
yes, by
again.
this time the Air Force had become a separate service in '47, and Lockburn Air Base was closed completely in June of '49, and we were assigned, if you will, around the world. My first experience came with in a bomb group in Salina, Kansas, and then Marchfield, California, and but just before the Korean War breakout, in the rotation and assignment of officer skills to the overseas locations that we had forces, they used a system that the number of months, your eligibility was based on the number of months that you'd been back from the combat theater. And out there at Marchfield in Riverside, California, I was high, having come home in November of '44 from Europe, and this is late '49. I was high on the list, and they needed maintenance officers in the Philippines, and found myself in early spring of 1950 with orders to go to the Philippines. Well, while en route, the war breaks out, and then they canceled family travel, and we didn't have our jet aircraft in position to support that United Nations call, and so P-51 pilots were in immediate demand, and being one, I found myself out of operations work, back in the fighter group, and on the way to the Philippines.
But at that point, you hadn't stepped foot in a P-51 in some years, so what was that like? You know?
That's one of the, now that was a thrill. Not a thrill that you really want, but we didn't have a great amount of time to prepare ourselves to pick up P-51s in Japan and begin the support of holding the perimeter there in Korea that had been down they called it the Pusan perimeter. And so you always read the tech order and fill out the paperwork, but we didn't get an opportunity to get any airtime. So I found myself, my last mission was 17th of November '44 in Europe, landing there at Remetelli on my last mission, and on July of '50 find myself strapped in the 51 and going down the runway in formation, so it was a little shaky at the time as we picked up aircraft at Johnson Air Base in Japan, flew down to Ashia, Japan, and began flying our combat support from there, while they built a strip just outside of Pusan for us to go and begin the support on the Korean Peninsula itself.
And what was the mission there for in
this
Korea?
was interdiction. The 18th Group, 2 squadrons, the 12th and 67th with P-51s, began the frontline support to support our troops as they contained the North Korean advance, and then begin to push them back up to the parallel that they had crossed, and even eventually on into the north.